Welcome to the Greenfield Report with Henry R. Greenfield, your gateway to understanding today's geopolitical landscape. With 50 years of experience across 10 countries, Henry shares expert insights on world affairs, offering practical solutions and engaging guest perspectives. Dive into the Greenfield Report for lively discussions on the issues that matter.
This is Henry R. Greenfield for the Greenfield Report, where today we will be meeting with a renowned economist and expert on areas ranging from monetary policy to the importance of the US dollar, and especially to free markets and his view on what is happening or not with the Trump tariff wars. We will be adding also a special section today on China, as our guest is one of the very few American experts who continues to go to China, and he will be there next month and will be meeting with senior Chinese officials and academics presenting in forums in China. Our guest is Dr. Dan Mitchell, who is the president for the Center for Freedom and Prosperity, a pro-market policy organization. He specializes in fiscal policy and trade and comparative economic systems. He earned his PhD in economics from George Mason University, and his daily columns can be read at www.danieljmitchell.wordpress.com. Dr. Mitchell and I met in Budapest, Hungary recently at a forum sponsored by the Danube Institute on free markets and what is happening or not in this area around the world. Dr. Mitchell, welcome to the Greenfield Report.
Glad to be with you.
Could you start by giving us an overview on your approach to free markets, as well as what's happening today, which I'm sorry to say is a lot about tariffs, and to give us some insights as to how you view the world is reacting to Trump these days on tariffs and how that fits with your approach to free markets?
I'm a big believer in having limited government and free markets. And unfortunately, right now, Trump's tariffs are creating a lot of uncertainty. Sometimes he puts them on, sometimes he takes them off. So we have no idea what the final result will be. But clearly, we're moving in a protectionist direction. The only debate is how far and how fast will we degenerate to that position. But there's also another issue that worries me a lot, and that's the governments are just too big and spending too much, and with aging populations and poorly designed entitlement programs, I do worry that we're heading towards some sort of Greek-style fiscal crisis, sort of a repeat of 2009. I don't know whether that'll happen 6 months from now or 6 years from now, but that's sort of the big long-term threat to global prosperity. The short-run threat to global prosperity are the Trump trade taxes.
So, I was going to ask you about that later, but you jumped right into it. I think it's quite important. Obviously, you have in your talks here in Europe, I've followed you and watched a lot of your presentations that you have made at conferences. You do not agree with the European approach from the EU with their interventionist approach, with their, as you say, the social benefits sound great, but at the end of the day, how can you afford them? So would you like to speak to that just a bit? Because we seem to be in the US to be kind of at loggerheads with trying to cut taxes, but then at the same time trying to keep benefits or not. But what is your view on that?
The big difference between the United States and Europe is that Europe is 10 to 15 years farther down the road toward bigger government and demographic problems than the US. The US has a medium-sized welfare state. Europe, at least in general, has a large-sized welfare state, Switzerland being an exception. And not all the countries are the same, of course. But here's the concern. Both of our populations are getting older. We're having fewer children. People are living longer. I have lots of gray hair, so I like the idea that we're all living longer. But from an economic and fiscal perspective, that's actually very, very bad news, because a welfare state of modest size is affordable if you have what's called a population pyramid. You have a few old people in your population, but then a big generation of workers and an even bigger generation of children, because welfare states are mostly about redistributing money from workers, of working age population, to old people who are getting pensions and, of course, most healthcare expenditures. And I worry very much with the demographic aging of our populations that the U.S. is heading toward where Europe is now, and Europe is just heading toward another crisis like 2009 all over again. But the problems will be more intractable, and I don't think anybody's going to be big enough to bail countries out when the you-know-what hits the fan.
Yeah, so obviously I live in Europe, so I understand that very much. And I think you've spoken about it. Even I, who I consider myself to be slightly center left, I also agree with you completely. It's The Economist, if you saw this week, had a special on effectively Europe wants to have their cake and eat it too. Let's just put it that way. In other words, they want all the social benefits, but they do not have the population to support it. They do not have, and you cannot just tax your way out of it. I agree with you. But just in keeping today on the US side, with the alchemy, I'm going to call it, of the current Trump tax cuts, plus still trying to maintain at least most of the benefits, even though some will be cut. What do you think about as a different solution, which is on the cost side? Have you thought about that at all?
As an American taxpayer, it's very frustrating to look at what's happened to the Republican Party. 10 years ago, the Republican Party was enacting, not getting into law, because of course Obama was in the White House, but the Republican Party in Congress was enacting budget resolutions that were predicated on very serious and very substantive Medicaid and Medicare reform. Those are our two big government healthcare programs, Medicaid for poor people, Medicare for old people. And those Republican budgets under the leadership of Paul Ryan were great. I mean, they were maybe not quite Javier Milei in Argentina in terms of the boldness, but they were very serious proposals that would have dramatically slowed the growth of government spending. And at the end of the day, when you're looking at fiscal policy, the most important variable is how fast is government growing on average compared to the growth of the private sector. The private sector, of course, being the tax base that's needed to support the government programs. So 10 years ago, Republicans were seriously trying to address and fix our long-run fiscal imbalance. Today, Trump says, don't touch Medicare, don't touch Social Security, don't touch Medicaid. And it really is a sad case of kicking the can down the road. And that's going to come back to bite us in a way that really worries me.
So I want to, sorry, I don't want to pound this one, but my view is this, and I'd like you to tell me I'm wrong if you believe I'm wrong. My belief is that we have a cost problem as well as a spending problem. We do, even Trump pointed out, we pay the highest drug prices. Okay. We have hospital corporations that are being controlled more and more by venture capitalists. These are just a couple of areas, right? And it seems to me that we have layered on too much. We have the planned benefit managers, not to get into medical policy, but we have a lot of layers in the system which make it very difficult to cut anything. Or maybe you don't agree with that.
I think America's healthcare system is certainly the most expensive and arguably one of the most inefficient systems in the world. And here's what I think is the fundamental problem. And a lot of healthcare wonks know this, but it certainly doesn't get discussed in terms of politicians very much. We have a massive problem in the United States with third-party payer. 90% of healthcare spending in the U.S. Is paid for by somebody other than the consumer. Almost half the people, almost half of healthcare spending is directly financed by government through Medicaid, Medicare, VA, and things like that. But even in the so-called private sector of healthcare, people are overwhelmingly buying healthcare with insurance dollars, not their own dollars. Now, of course, you could say it really is their money because it's taken out of their paycheck because of the insurance plans. But at the actual point of sale, you are not spending your own money for the most part in healthcare. And what incentive is there for me as a consumer to try to make sure I'm getting a good deal. And certainly providers, if they know that consumers aren't very price sensitive, because 90% of the spending will be paid for by someone other than them, at least again at the point of sale, providers love that system because they can make everything a lot more expensive because they know there's not much price sensitivity. So here's the problem. Let's break it down to what really matters. We would have a much more efficient and better healthcare system if consumers were paying for all routine costs directly out of pocket. Obviously, you would still have insurance for large unexpected costs like having a heart attack or getting cancer, just the same way that, our homeowner's insurance doesn't cover the cost of repainting your dining room or buying a new couch. It's for if you have a major fire or something like that. So we have over insurance, or in the case of government programs, over coverage, and it means that nobody or almost nobody cares about how much healthcare costs. And so we have very high prices because there's no competition on the consumer end, and we have a lot of inefficiency because, of course, this system requires a huge amount of paperwork. So our healthcare system is not a free market healthcare system in the US. It is very expensive. It's definitely not buyers and sellers directly interacting, which is what you get in a free market situation. Now, by the way, let me say one final thing. We do actually have a few sectors of our healthcare system where consumers are paying with their own money. Things like laser eye surgery, things like cosmetic surgery. Those are areas where a genuine free market exists. And what do we see? Instead of healthcare costs growing like this in Medicare and Medicaid and things like that, healthcare costs are flat or even coming down. So when we do allow the markets to operate, we actually do have a lower cost efficient healthcare system. But unfortunately, that doesn't describe most parts of our healthcare system. And I'll say one other thing, because you mentioned about pharmaceutical prices. Here's the frustrating thing as an American. Most drugs are developed, and the main target audience is the U.S. market. But there's a lot of expense in terms of research to produce new drugs. Well, other countries who have government-run healthcare systems or have a lot of price controls, they look at the marginal cost of producing a pill and they say, okay, to whatever pharmaceutical company, Pfizer or something like that, we'll pay you the marginal cost of producing the pill plus 10% or 20%. Whereas American consumers are paying the market price. Well, guess what? The net result of that is the entire R&D budget of the pharmaceutical industry is being borne by American consumers. Now, that's obviously not fair, but if we want R&D, if we want new drugs being developed, somebody has to pay that cost. And so the rest of the world is in effect free riding off American consumers being the ones paying market prices and in effect underwriting all R&D costs. Now, the Trump administration, just like the Biden administration, thinks the answer to that is, well, maybe we should slap price controls so that the pharmaceutical companies can't impose the higher cost on American consumers. But if the net result of that is the whole world has price controls, we won't have R&D, or we won't have nearly as much, and we'll probably wind up, you and me, Robert, might be dying earlier than we otherwise would because whatever drugs might save our lives 15 years or 20 years in the future aren't going to be developed.
Okay, first of all, I'm going to agree with you. It's not sustainable. Don't forget, I've lived in 10 countries, so I've got at least 10 different medical systems I've had to deal with in my life so far. The one that is most interesting and applicable is actually Australia. Just for your information, they have a blended system, which is very similar to what you're saying. In other words, if you want to go what's called a private option, you pay more, even though in your insurance is primarily for, let's say, additional costs. It's not for your bread and butter costs kind of things. And their big worry, by the way, when Trump came out in particular, was that they're going to have to start paying their own fair share because they are doing exactly what you're saying. They negotiate on a national basis with Pfizer, Merck, et cetera, and they get the lowest cost in the world, whereas the American consumers are carrying it. This is part of the problem, by the way, with the rest of the world. When they are mocking the U.S., they don't realize that in the United States, one way or another, the Americans have carried a lot of these costs, whether it's the development of China, which you go to quite often, right? Or whether it's this kind of area with the drug side. the United States has borne these costs, and they are no longer sustainable. So, again, as a libertarian, how does the United States get out of this cycle?
Well, that's a great question. And unfortunately, I probably don't have a great answer because unless somehow the US can force foreign countries to pay more, which I don't know, maybe Trump can use some executive order or something to say, based on income, countries can't buy American pharmaceuticals unless they pay instead of 20% above the marginal cost of producing a pill. Maybe they have to pay 50% or 100%, depending on their per capita income. And that would spread out the costs of allowing pharmaceutical companies to have R&D budgets. But I don't know. All I know is that the current system does disadvantage American consumers compared to foreign consumers. As you say, it's not sustainable. Something probably has to happen, but I don't know what it'll be. I worry, given the nature of politics, that we'll just wind up with global price controls and we won't get that R&D that is so crucial to future healthcare.
Well, obviously, I'm in agreement with you on that. But let's move that back to Trump on his policies that are working or not working. So there's a lot of people who would agree with, and I think you said this in Budapest as I was listening to you. In principle, there's a lot of things you agree with the Trump policies, but it seems to the rest of the world that Trump spends more time going up and down, or what we would call blowing up the ship, than finding policies that are going to work in the long run. So therefore, the rest of the world really doesn't know what to do. So what do you see, as Trump's policies? Are they working or are they not working, or are we missing something outside the United States?
I think it all depends what policy you're looking at. On trade, it is incredibly haphazard. That's presumably the issue most people outside America are focusing on because it affects them directly. And depending on who you talk to in the administration, it's either pure protectionism, sort of like Peter Navarro and the Commerce Secretary Lutnick. These people seem to be genuine, true believing, Smoot-Hawley 1930s style protectionists. You have other people in the administration who I think have a more rational perspective. There are bad trade policies in other countries. Trump focuses on that. He's obviously very fixated on whether other countries are treating American exports fairly or not. But he sort of ignores the fact that we have some of our own pre-existing protectionist policies in the United States. Now, in theory, back in the good old days when we used to have these, like the Uruguay round of GATT negotiations and the WTO, the focus of the world was, well, how can we sort of jointly reduce our protectionist barriers to have more free trade? Trump, here's the fundamental problem with Trump. He thinks a trade deficit by itself is a sign that somehow America is losing or being screwed or being treated unfairly. Now, of course, that's not true. The U.S. is bigger and richer than most countries, so of course we can afford to buy more from other countries than they can buy more from us. Not only that, but oftentimes when foreigners earn money by selling to the U.S. consumers, they like using that money to invest in the U.S. economy. So the dollars come back to the U.S. I mean, almost by definition, in some sort of macro perspective, there's balance. It's just that some dollars come back to buy American goods and services. Some dollars come back to be invested in the U.S. economy, which by and large is a sign of American strength. The fact that foreigners want to be, purchasing American equities and bonds and things like that. The one exception is, obviously, foreigners buy a lot of U.S. government debt. That's not bringing dollars back to the U.S. in a productive way. That's bringing dollars back to the U.S. in a way that just subsidizes our fiscal incontinence.
Yeah, so I think here for me the core principle is, as some other people I've interviewed in the past, they call this the financialization of the American economy versus the industrialization of the American economy. And if you looked at The Economist, again, not to mention them more than once, but they have a whole edition this week on the over-reliance on manufacturing, and as opposed to what you're talking about, which is accepting that the US economy has fundamentally changed and it has become a services and a financial economy. And going back to an industrialized policy is just simply not going to work. What is your view on that?
Well, there are two things that I think are important to understand. First, manufacturing employment has fallen substantially in the United States. However, manufacturing output as a share of GDP has been relatively stable. So the real story is that the manufacturing sector has become a lot more productive. We need far fewer man hours to produce a car today or a ton of steel than we used to in the past. And by the way, that's true everywhere in the world. Manufacturing jobs are declining as a share of the population in China. It's a function of the productivity and the entrepreneurship of economic all economies, not just the U.S. economy. So there's nothing wrong with manufacturing employment falling as a share of total employment if it simply means that we're more productive, and that frees up labor to be in jobs that, by and large, people prefer. People prefer service-oriented jobs. In many cases, they pay a lot more, and certainly the work is a lot less physically taxing or physically dangerous. Now, let me shift from manufacturing over to the finance sector. I'm not a big fan of this idea that financialization, quote unquote, has been happening, or at least not in a negative sense. America's capital markets, I think, are the envy of the world. They're a very efficient system for directing capital to where it's going to generate the most growth and the highest rates of return, which, of course, even for those of us who aren't in the finance sector, that can rebound to our benefit in terms of higher wages, greater productivity, things like that. Now, having said that, do we have some policies that I think are very silly, where the financial system, in effect, creates risk rather than reduces risk? I look at things like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, are two government-created entities that subsidize the housing sector. I mean, that played a huge role in the 2008 financial crisis. So I love the manufacturing sector. I love the finance sector. I love the private sector because it's made us rich by historical standards and by comparative standards, and it's helping to spread prosperity all around the world. But that doesn't mean that I want industrial policy to subsidize manufacturing, or that I want Fannie and Freddie creating systemic risk in the housing and finance sector.
So let me ask you, put it to you in another way. That's very interesting. It would seem to me that what you were saying, and again, listening to your various talks, that what was going on in the U.S. economy was when Trump came in was not necessarily anything that needed to be dramatically changed, other than we could talk about taxes, etc. But the big thing that you talked about, or your recommendation, that when I asked you that question in Budapest, was that you said that you would recommend that Trump would have done more gradual tariffs and not this up and down. Is this up and down kind of freaking out people like Jamie Dimon, who's talking about recession, or what's going on there?
My view is that Trump should have gone back to the old post-World War II consensus of multilateral negotiations to try to bring down trade barriers. And yes, maybe as part of that process, when you're dealing with countries that are very protectionist, like India overtly and China more implicitly, okay, maybe you jack up tariffs on them a little bit as part of a negotiating thing, and this, of course, gets into this whole debate: is Trump playing three-dimensional chess, or is he just sort of blundering his way through? I fear it's more the latter than the former, because if he was doing something very clever, why is he imposing higher trade taxes on, you mentioned Australia. Australia doesn't have big trade barriers to the U.S. I mean, all these countries that we have free trade agreements with, and yet Trump is raising their trade taxes. He even raised trade taxes on the Heard and McDonald Islands, which don't have any people and don't export anything. So some of it was amateur hour. But this brings me back to what I already said, Robert, which is that, unfortunately, Trump thinks a trade deficit itself is the problem that needs to be addressed. And I just think that's fundamentally wrong. So yes, I wish he was much more focused on, okay, let's try to encourage some countries that are protectionist to lower their barriers. And by the way, as part of that, reduce some of the barriers that we still have. I think free trade is a good principle that has served the world well. And so many people in the Trump administration don't have that understanding, unfortunately. And the president is
Let's
one of
talk
them.
let's talk about somebody who might have an understanding, right? My favorite person, I don't want to call him my favorite, but I think the last guardrail, you mentioned Navarro, you mentioned Lutnick, my person who I actually have some confidence in, and I want to know, your learned opinion, is Scott Bessant. Do you believe that? How important is he, or am I exaggerating his importance in terms of like keeping the wheels on and not letting everything fall apart?
My assumption is I don't know Scott Bessant personally at all, but my assumption is that Bessant and Kevin Hassett, the top economist in the White House, I assume that they're counseling Trump in the right direction and hopefully offsetting the bad advice from Lutnick and Navarro. But I'm obviously not privy to those discussions. So all I can say is that I'm glad they're there. I assume they're doing good things. Now, having said that, I mean, Bessant, I think it was testifying on Capitol Hill just earlier this week. He made this preposterous argument that tariffs aren't taxes. Now, does he actually believe that? I'm sure he doesn't. But this administration forces people, in effect, if you want to continue in your position, you're basically forced to say things that are very silly because otherwise Trump might take it the wrong way, and all of a sudden you're out on the street.
Yeah, I look at Bassan as like one of those guys in Trump 1.0 is exactly what you said. He has to say certain things in public, but after all, he's a hedge fund manager originally, all the way back to the Soros days. And I think that he's learned how to, let's say, keep his powder dry and make good economic decisions. So I don't want to put too many laurels on his head, but I'm happy that he's there. And I think you would agree, right?
Oh, I want there to be good people in the Trump White House because presumably they're going to help steer Trump in the right direction because I don't think Trump has any sort of underlying economic philosophy. He sort of just approaches everything like it's some sort of business negotiation. He certainly probably has a bias that too much red tape is bad and excessive taxes are bad, but I don't think he really thinks deeply about economic policy more broadly.
So obviously, you're not very keen on what we would call industrial policy, especially not, let's say, the European side. But I want to ask you a question. Biden did something that classical or classic libertarians like you really are not very fond of, which is he was doing the pick winners and losers with his industrial policies, specifically on AI, solar, TSMC, which he pushed to bring back the chips. Do you feel that there is in terms of your own beliefs and your own experience, a place for strategic industrial policy, or should we really let the free market dictate what happens?
I guess it depends how you define industrial policy. My preference is to bring the corporate tax rate down as low as possible, move from a depreciation system to full expensing so companies are no longer penalized through the tax code for making new investments, and then let American industry do what it does best, which is to try to create goods and services that are attractive to consumers because that's how they make money at the end of the day for their shareholders. I think that, as a general principle, unquestionably is the way to go. Now, let me bend over backwards and sort of give the other perspective. Taiwan is obviously a major player for semiconductors and things like that. If you're sitting in the White House and you're thinking, China might not be a good actor on the global stage, and maybe they'll invade Taiwan sometime in the next 1 to 5 years. I mean, I hope that's not the case, but people in the White House should be thinking about those possibilities. And if you know that a lot of American industry is reliant on high-end semiconductors from Taiwan, and there is this non-zero threat that supplies from Taiwan could be totally disrupted, it would be a good idea to have alternative sources in the free world of high-end semiconductors, whether produced in America or produced in other friendly countries. So I can understand that there is an argument. How do you deal with that kind of situation? Do I think sort of just blind, blundering, open-ended subsidies to different semiconductor countries as semiconductor companies is the way to go? No, I don't. But there was a rationale. There was a reason, and a lot of economic policy. And I'm sure you know this, Robert, from having discussed so much of it over the years. A lot of economic policy is, well, there is a little bit of an argument for this, but then you have to factor in the real world of how politics and the sausage making process will, in effect, twist it and distort it before you get to final legislation. And you have to sort of decide costs and benefits. Is a clumsy, politically influenced piece of legislation, are the benefits worth it because it'll achieve something, even though the politicians are going to impose all these additional costs? That is an open and fair question. But suffice to say, I think what Biden did was definitely a clumsy, ill-advised way of trying to address what is a genuine issue.
Okay, well, at least we're going to agree on that something should be done to make sure that TSMC doesn't get cut off if there was any kind of China military action towards Taiwan. That brings me to the China question, which is something that I was very intrigued on. Unfortunately, we didn't get into that when I last saw you speak, but you and your colleague both had pretty strong opinions. And I think, are you going to be on your way to China soon?
Yeah, I'll be teaching there for a week. Actually, more like 10 days in July.
And what are you going to be discussing there?
Mostly fiscal policy, but of course, trade is inevitably going to be part of the discussion. Comparative economic systems. Here's the thing about China. 15, 20 years ago, almost everybody in Washington was very optimistic. China, of course, had done some economic liberalization in the 1980s and 1990s. They climbed out of sort of the terrible poverty that Maoist communism had created. They integrated themselves to some degree in the world economy. And I think people were very optimistic, including me, I'll confess, that China was going to evolve into sort of a normal market-oriented country. Maybe not a Western-style democracy, but nonetheless a good trading partner and a valuable part of global commerce. There's a lot of concern now, and one of the big changes in Washington over the last 20 years is that both Republicans and Democrats are now much more skeptical and much more suspicious of China. And the concern is that President Xi, not only has become, moved China back in the direction of more government control, and especially in terms of misallocation of capital, favoritism, what companies are getting access to capital markets and subsidies and things like that. So China is moving in the wrong direction in terms of economic reform. But then also there's a lot of concern that China, might be trying to cause, might be a threat to global peace. And obviously, I'm not any sort of expert on that piece of it, but I definitely know that people in Washington, Republicans and Democrats alike, now view China with, at the very least, a lot more skepticism and suspicion, where there was this feeling of hope 15 to 20 years ago. Now, the question is, what's China going to be 10 years from now or 15 years from now? I mean, hopefully this is just a temporary blip and that the concerns are unwarranted. But who knows? I can't make those predictions.
Yeah, my view on that, I think I mentioned to you, my first time to China was 1981. So I remember those bad old days when cabbages were, what did you want for lunch? Cabbage. Dinner, cabbage, So it was in Chinese, I'm sure you know this word, mayo, we don't have, right, kind of thing, to today where you have an abundance of many things. But also, I agree with you, WTO came in. It was not all bad, by the way. I work for American corporations that won on WTO, let's say on software, where we had a specific strategy at Autodesk to harvest. That means to get, the illegal copies to become legal. So it wasn't all a bad thing for a long time. I would agree with you completely that Xi Jinping changed things dramatically for China and everybody else. The question is that you are asking, which is the fundamental question, is China reverting back to the 5,000-year China history, which is the center of the universe, as the name implies that it's the center, the Middle Kingdom, or is China moving? Is it going to, once Xi Jinping passes from the scene, is it going to be something else? Well, as you know, even in the case of Trump with the Republican Party, if you put enough of your followers in charge, whether it's J.D. Vance or somebody in China that is beneath Xi Jinping, the next generation is going to at least follow that for some period of time. So my biggest concern, and that's why I asked you about the strategic side, whether it's rare earth metals, as you know, I'm sure you're quite well versed in this. The U.S. made its own, had its own rare earths metals system. They were refined in Indiana. We lost that because of, China could do it cheaper. China did not have the environmental controls. So it seems to me, and again, I don't think you're saying you disagree, but it's not easy for the government to pick the winners and the losers. But there are certain strategic areas, I hope you would agree, that the United States needs to protect itself, or at least find strong allies to do that type of work. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think we're on the same page in that regard. The one area, though, where I think we have to factor in Trump's thinking is he doesn't think it's okay if, say, Canada is producing. He wants everything being produced in America. So, I'm a big, I'm a big believer that what Trump should have run on and what he should be trying to administer is global free trade among free nations. And that, in effect, can be sort of a carrot to encourage other nations to liberalize their both political and economic systems. But again, he doesn't distinguish. He's protectionist against nations that are our closest allies, and he's protectionist against countries that maybe are a problem.
I think that you've hit on the central issue for me with Trump, which is not the clumsiness on the tariffs, which is its own problem, but he's not fostering this type of strategy, which is to use the democratic countries in particular to do this kind of working together. In fact, he's a zero sum game guy. So before we end up here, I do want to ask you. This is kind of important as a libertarian economist. What would you do to change, or is Trump on the right economic path with his one big, beautiful bill? And if not, what would you recommend for him to change?
The problem with the one big, beautiful bill is a sin of omission. There's really, other than a little bit of anti-fraud provisions and in terms of the Medicaid program, there's really no effort to contain the long-run expansion of the burden of entitlement spending, and that is the biggest threat to America's fiscal health, just like it's the threat to the fiscal health of European countries. And by the way, something I didn't mention earlier, I mean, as a general principle, I'm critical of European fiscal policy, but you look at some countries like Denmark, the retirement age is going up to 70. They have budget surpluses. Their government debt is very small. I mean, their welfare state, from my perspective, is far too big, but you can be a responsible left of center government. It's not impossible. It's just unusual. The problem in America is we have an irresponsible right of center government because we're not controlling the growth of government spending. I like the idea as a libertarian of people having lower taxes, but simply giving people a tax cut, and it's actually not a tax cut, it's just mostly an extension of the 2017 tax cut, but keeping taxes low, especially for lower income and middle class people, I think that's wonderful, but it's not going to be sustainable if you don't have some sort of spending restraint at some point in the system. And here's another thing to remember. You can't finance a big welfare state by taxing the rich. If you could do that, European countries would have done it. All the European countries that have bigger sized welfare states, they finance them with big taxes on middle class and lower income people, the VATs, the payroll taxes we already talked about. So I
Well,
wish Trump.
you mentioned a very interesting one here. By the way, I have close family members. Obviously, I live here. I know lots of people who live with these tax regimes. Some more successfully than others. They're very complicated in the EU. But you did bring out one very interesting one, which I want to ask you. It seems to me that eventually Trump is going to have to switch from his tariff regime to a VAT. Do you agree? And if so, I believe that's a step in the wrong direction because now you're really transferring a heavy burden to young families, middle class, etc. So, anyway, what is your thoughts on will a VAT come into place? Because he cannot pay for everything with tariffs, right?
Correct. Tariffs. There's a big Laffer curve with tariffs because once your tariffs are getting 10, 20%, or even some of these ridiculous levels that Trump is talking about, you actually do close off global trade. And so it doesn't matter how high your tariffs are. If you have no imports, you're not going to collect any revenue. So there's a naturally limiting factor. I mean, Alexander Hamilton understood this with the Federalist Papers, 250 years ago or whatever it was. So if you leave government on autopilot, sooner or later there will be a value-added tax. Now I say that with unhappiness, just like sooner or later we're both going to die, Robert. I wish that wasn't the case, but unless there's some medical miracle, at some point in the next 30 or 40 years, we're both going to say goodbye to the earth. I don't like making some predictions, and I don't like making the prediction that we're going to have a value-added tax. But unless Republicans decide to become more responsible, or maybe Democrats become responsible like they were back during the Bill Clinton era, somehow, some way, someone in Washington has to decide we need to slow down the growth of government spending. My ideal system would be copying Switzerland, where they have something called a debt brake, which is effectively a spending cap. And ever since voters implemented that back in the early 2000s, I mean, Switzerland has gotten so much stronger, so much richer. Its fiscal policy is sort of the role model for the world. Its government spending burden as a share of GDP is lower than the United States. They become richer than the United States. So again, don't look at Europe as just one big blob. You have some very successful small government countries like Switzerland. You have some successful big government countries like Denmark. But a lot of countries, France, Italy, so on and so forth, their policies are not admirable. Now, by the way, not to get us off on a tangent, but do you know that Greece a few years ago adopted private retirement accounts and their long-run pension spending as a share of GDP, according to OECD data, is going to come down by 2 to 3 percentage points. So even in countries that you think of as being really misgoverned for years, you can find elements of good public policy. Here's the bottom line. The world is a laboratory. And nations are the different experiments. And within nations, different issue areas are the experiments. And I think all those experiments, both inside countries and across countries, do teach us that it's important to contain the size and scope of government if you want to maximize prosperity for people.
Well, I think we're actually a lot closer to each other than you believe. I think that there is a vast majority in the center in the United States and around the world that just want to get up in the morning, have a non-corrupt government, pay a reasonable tax, and be able to to live normally and have decent lives. But I think you've pointed out, Dr. Mitchell, several really important points. One of which I hadn't thought enough about. But you are right that there is no such thing as a free medical system or a free lunch. It is true that you have to, medical, as I've discussed with other people, is a case of rationing around the world. And the way to ration that, of course, is to let people at least pay something. And if you make it so that they're paying nothing. Now, of course, in order to pay something, you got to pay them also a proper wage. So there's a lot of things involved there. By the way, on the Switzerland thing, I do have very good friends. I live near to Switzerland. And I can say this, Switzerland has social cohesion, which right now the United States does not have enough of, but they have very strong social cohesion and people buy into that. So they believe in the system and they participate in the system and they do the right thing by and large. I think that the United States, unfortunately, with the two extremes, is moving away from that, blaming each other. And I don't think it's going to end well. Do you have any final remarks that you'd like to make? Maybe not on that subject, but before we go.
Well, I can't resist actually commenting on what you just said, because what's amazing about the social cohesion that you pinpoint in Switzerland is that it's in a country where you have French speaking regions, Italian speaking regions, German speaking regions. You even have Romanish. One of the big reasons for Swiss success is not only good economic policy, but the decentralization. You don't feel like if you're German speaking, you don't feel like the French speaking regions are your enemy because they're making their own decisions. Whereas the German speaking cantons, they're making their decisions. In the US, we have centralized so much government policy. And obviously, Florida is not the same as New York, and Texas is not the same as California. I think some Swiss style decentralization would solve a lot of our problems with national division. I mean, there's no question that people seem to dislike each other more. We're polarizing in terms of where we live. We're polarizing in terms of whether we like people. Heck, there's even data out there that people are polarizing in terms of dating. Well, someone's of a different party, I'm not going to want to go out to dinner with them. That's probably not good. And I like to think, maybe I'm just an optimist, but I like to think a Swiss-style system of decentralization would be good for just the health of the American political system.
Well, I want to agree with you 100% because, as they say about in Switzerland, as you know, they have votes on everything in each cantonment, right? And they say that if you ask the typical Swiss citizen about some local measure, they'll tell you everything what's going on, and they're thrilled to vote. But if you ask them who is the president of Switzerland, more than half would not know.
That is a very, very healthy sign for a country. You want to be able to live in a system where you can have a good, productive life without knowing who the politicians are. I mean, in some sense, that might be the greatest measure of how successful a country is.
Well, maybe I'm not going to say that you're going to say this, but I would recommend to President Trump to dial it back a little bit, okay? And let's let some of those states' rights keep on growing as opposed to executive or federal control. Would you at least agree with that?
Oh, I definitely agree. But Trump is not going to dial it back. It is who he is. And on one level, it's entertaining, it's colorful. It certainly makes it interesting to look at the news. But wouldn't it be so much better if we didn't have to worry about that kind of drama in our lives? I, for one, think decentralization, smaller government, and not having to pay attention to politics would be a very healthy long-run outcome for the United States. And it doesn't mean we're going to live in my libertarian fantasy world of government only 5% of GDP. Maybe we'll be like Switzerland, where government's 30% of GDP. But as long as there's enough breathing room for the private sector to function, in the grand scheme of things, would I prefer smaller government and growing 3% a year compared to medium-sized government and growing 2.5% a year? Yes, I would. But you know what? We'll have a good life regardless with either one of those two approaches.
Well, I'll end by saying I'm sure this is a person you don't agree very much with her. Nancy Pelosi once, when she was challenged a couple of years ago, she said, "You guys are going to have to all get over it. In the end, we're all capitalists." So I want to thank you for being on the Greenfield Report. This has been a fascinating time. If you don't mind, we may check back in with you after you come back from China. We'll be really interested to hear what your take is on China, especially at this pivotal moment in history. Today, we have been speaking with Dr. Dan Mitchell, who is a global expert on a whole host of areas ranging from dollars and monetary policy to obviously economics, government, and taxes. We want to thank you very much, Dr. Mitchell, and wish you well on your trip to China.
Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to it. I'm still in the long run an optimist that China will become a rich, successful, market-oriented country. The Chinese are rich everywhere they go in the world, except for in China. So if they liberalize, the sky's the limit for prosperity for China.
Well, thank you very much. This is Henry R. Greenfield signing off with our special guest, Dr. Dan Mitchell.
Thank you for joining us on the Greenfield Report with Henry R. Greenfield. We hope today's insights into the ever-shifting geopolitical landscape have sparked your curiosity and broadened your perspective. Stay connected with us for more in-depth discussions and expert solutions. Until next time, keep exploring the world beyond the headlines.